So when I was in ninth grade, I developed a crush on a young man who was preparing to enter the monastery. I was a teenager. He was a few years older than I was. He was from a big Russian family, the youngest son. He was good. He was kind. And when he met a giggly, red-faced girl named Liz and kissed her, I was devastated. My crush was, of course, Alexei Karamazov. I was
Mm.
in my second year in a classical Catholic K-12 that my parents had helped to found in the Phoenix area in Arizona. And my teacher was a graduate of Thomas Aquinas College. He's now a Franciscan friar of the Renewal. But he had this training in this literature and he introduced it to us. And this was my first experience with sort of the intensity of Socratic discussion. He took us through the text really slowly. It was a ninth and 10th grade blended class. We would sit in a circle, we would talk and talk and talk. um, he really gave us a lot of room to ask questions and to discuss with one another. And I became so invested. The world of Fyodor Dostoevsky became so real
Mm.
to me that I responded viscerally to what was happening in the text. And when we finished finally reading this book, I was bereft. I felt like I had lost close friends. And
Yeah.
this feeling lingered with me for days. And it was such a formative experience because I had been reading, I loved reading all my life. But until that moment when I had really entered into the story, I had never had that experience. So since I was a child, I always loved writing stories and even illustrating some of them since I could first learn to write. And part of what I did, and I think this is because of just what I saw around me, is I made my family white. I hadn't really read any literature where anyone wasn't white or seen much, television or movies. So we were a Spanish speaking family from South Texas. I'm born in South Texas. My parents and my siblings, my grandparents from Mexico. And my parents had experienced some prejudice growing along the border. So they decided to teach us English. And then
Mm.
we moved to Phoenix when I was 2 or 3. So we didn't really have that exposure to the border where we had originally been born. But somehow, even though my parents spoke Spanish every day, they listened to Spanish music and radio and watched Spanish television, I wasn't really connected to the culture. And I think that was just sort of based on what I saw or didn't see around me. And as some of the other speakers have said, I'm not trying to make this about race. It didn't really enter my mind. I just sort of didn't see this around me, aside from my cousins. So the literature that I read in my life with my cousins, my big family, didn't really connect. And so there was a sort of a separation there. So fast forward, um, I I went to this classical Catholic school, K-12, called Wildermere Academy. It's in Scottsdale, Arizona. It's still there. It's thriving. We were part of the founding families. My parents are educators and wanted something better for us. And my parents didn't really understand the great books tradition. I think they had not been trained that way, but they understood its value. So they put us in this school. And it was there that I was introduced, as I mentioned in this earlier story, that's where I was introduced to these great texts, to these texts that came alive. And I sort of think that the reason I ended up becoming a historian is because I was fascinated by the historical context around which these stories were produced. Sort of thinking about Russia in the time of Fyodor Dostoevsky, thinking about the ancient times of reading the Iliad and the Odyssey, thinking about Rome when we have the Aeneid. These are things that really fascinated me, and I think probably that's how I ended up becoming a historian. Um, so when I was in my high school, again, this sort of idea of race didn't really come into mind. I wasn't really seeing it in the text I was reading. I wasn't thinking about it too much, except to sort of disassociate myself from my Mexican background. Um, I saw the way Mexicans were treated in Phoenix, and there was a Mexican community lived sort of outside the outskirts of Phoenix. And when I went on the school bus when I was younger, students would shout terrible racist things out the window. And I thought, oh, good thing I'm not Mexican. And when I got to high school, even I would hear remarks about, oh, those Mexicans playing their music loudly. And I always thought, well, good thing I'm not Mexican, right? This is not part of who I am. So it wasn't really a part of my experience growing up, despite having Spanish speaking parents who are of Mexican heritage. I didn't quite think about it or join them together. So I went off to, after high school, I went off to the St. Ignatius Institute, which is a great books program, a Catholic great books program at the University of San Francisco. It's sort of the version of it that I attended sort of shut down the year I graduated, around the year 2000. And while I was at the St. Ignatius Institute, I read some of the same works and then went even deeper in the conversations, and then was introduced to, philosophy. I was introduced to theology. I was introduced to a lot more in this great books program. And I did have a professor who was Greek and Cuban, and he was an ancient Greek sort of literature professor, and he was almost everybody's favorite professor. And he gave us these wonderful, wonderful lectures and introduced us to this wonderful text. But again, even though he had this Latino culture, I never sort of thought beyond the fact that, well, he has both, right? He has a Greek background, he has a Latino background, and that's perhaps why he loves it so much. I didn't make any connections. I didn't know there were any connections between Latin America. I'd never heard anybody talk about this tradition being part of Latin America. It came from the other part of the world, right, to the Americas. So, and this professor, Dr. Leyva, he's now a Father Simeon, he's now a Trappist monk back east. I also had, so there were sort of a handful of really wonderful professors in this great books program I was in. And in my senior year, everyone was required to take a senior seminar, sort of a capstone where you write a big project. And the theme that year happened to be warfare. So our senior seminar was about warfare. I don't remember a lot of the texts that we read. I believe we began with Timothy O'Brien's Of Things They Carry, but I don't quite remember some of the other texts, except for this book, The Cypresses Believe in God. This is Jose Maria Gironea, and he wrote this in 1953. It's about the Spanish Civil War. I didn't know anything really about the Spanish Civil War. Didn't know much about Spain aside from what I had learned in my Spanish, language classes. But this book, I mean, I had talked about I had never really seen my family or anyone like me in literature. And this book was like looking at my family in a mirror. I couldn't believe this book. And as I read through it, it just kept getting more and more like my family. So the mother, Carmen Elgatzu, is this really strong Catholic woman who really holds the family together. And the book occurs over several years. And at one point, Lent comes. And so this woman, she'll say, no gum chewing during Lent, no card playing, no radio, she's very strict. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's my mom. This is my mom, like this strong Catholic woman who's so serious about her faith and loves her family. That's my mom. And I had never seen a character like that in literature until I met Carmen Elgatzu. And one of the brothers in one of her sons was named Ignacio. And I'm like, well, my brother's named Ignacio. So the connections I saw here were really astonishing. And I just wanted to read one quote from this book that describes this woman, Carmen Elgatzu, that really resonated with me. Speaking about her, Carmen Elgatzu, the mother, she was of medium height with intensely black hair drawn back in a knot and a head set firmly on her shoulders. When, with her sleeves rolled up, she was washing clothes, one could see what beautifully turned arms she had. Her waist revealed the fact that she had borne children. Her legs were the two pillars of the household. That's my mom. So it took till my senior year of college till I finally read a book that made me see that there did exist families like mine in literature, that the stories I had been writing, making myself Rachel Smith, I didn't have to do that. I could write about us as us. And that was a really powerful moment for me. And I think that's what really started me down this path where I ended up becoming a Latin American historian. I wanted to write about my family. So I was a creative writing, I was an English major with an emphasis in creative writing in college. So I went off to Penn State to get a Master of Fine Arts in creative nonfiction. So in order to really understand my family and why, I wondered, why are we Mexican Catholic? Like, I want to know the historical context. And I had been turned on to that by reading about the Spanish Civil War. and reading about how the sort of the history of that really affected the story and what happened to the characters. And I wanted to know more. So I had always loved history. My mother minored in history. She used to talk about it. I had felt fascinated with, but it wasn't until I went off to my MFA program at Penn State that I said, okay, I'm going to take some history classes on Latin American history so I can contextualize what I'm writing about my family. And I took a graduate seminar first, and the professor, Matthew Russell, he's rather famous as a Latin American historian. He said, you have a talent for this. You should become a historian. I said, oh no, I'm a writer. I'm just in here for context. I just want to get and he said, well, take another class. Why don't you take an undergraduate class with me? Because in graduate school, you read secondary sources. You read what people think about the topics. But in undergrad, you read primary sources. And I had not taken any Latin American history in college. I knew very little about Latin America. So I took this undergraduate course with him, and the primary sources, they spoke to me. I loved it. I loved that I could see what was happening. We had sources from Native people. And I didn't know that. So that's how I sort of fell into this with the encouragement of this Latin American historian. And I became, my own background as being Mexican Catholic. So I became a scholar specializing in the origins of Mexican Catholicism, thinking about the ways that the earliest Franciscan friars who arrived 1523, 1524, worked together with local Native peoples in the Mexico City area, that sort of central area, to develop a new sort of indigenous Christianity, what we now call Mexican Catholicism. So that's my specialty. And you fast forward, I had gone from this classical high school great books education to a great books undergraduate program. And then I went off to graduate school, and I sort of shifted away from that. Or so I thought. I imagine as a Latin American historian, this really doesn't have, how we say in Spanish, no tiene nada que ver, right? It doesn't have one to do with the other. And I didn't realize I was wrong. But it took many years of studying this. So after Penn State, I went off to UCLA and for my doctoral work in colonial Mexican history, where I continued that specialization in 16th century Mexico. And I do recall there was one day I was in the library in the stacks, and I was trying to find some books for a research paper, and I found this thin little book, and it was in Spanish, called Latin in Colonial Mexico. And I thought, oh, well, I studied Latin in high school. I should read this. That's interesting, just for my own knowledge. I think that would be fun. Checked it out. I remember sitting on a stack of books for a long time. And as a graduate student, you're so busy with so many things. And I had to work to get enough money to pay my rent. And so there was never really any time. I ended up turning that book in, and I never read it. And I wonder if I should go back and try to find that book again. But so I knew, and initially I thought, well, maybe they just meant like Latin during Mass, but no, it's about Latin being taught in the schools. So as I continued in my career as a Latin American historian, I used to teach world history almost every semester. And when we would talk about ancient Greeks and sometimes, and also the ancient Romans, I would try to tell about the Iliad or the Odyssey, the Aeneid. And each year that went by without me rereading it, I remembered less and less. And I felt really sort of sad. These characters, these stories, all of this had been so formative to me. And I felt that, how sad that the career that I chose that I absolutely loved was taking me further and further away from this anchor, this foundation that I had. And I just didn't know how to answer that. And even, the honor college and some of the other, opportunities for me to teach just weren't really there because they don't have Latin American voices in great books. So what am I supposed to do? I thought, well, I guess I just have to read it on my own when I have some time, which is never. I have 3 small children and, working. And so that was really kind of sad to me as time went on, that I was losing that. I was losing all of this knowledge that I had gained and all this really important sort of friendships with these characters. So a few years ago, in 2022, I decided to leave my full-time position. I was at Azusa Pacific University for 10 years. I decided to leave, focus on my family, homeschool my kids for a little bit. And I had an opportunity from the Angelicum Academy, which is a Catholic homeschooling program. They had been offering Socratic discussions, this very well-developed high school program, a 4-year program. You could even get additional college credits and even get an AA degree by the time you graduate from 12th grade. So this is an online program, and they have been doing this since the year 2000. So it's been almost 24 years now, almost 25. And they contacted me and said, well, we've been having requests from families who want our program in Spanish. Can you develop it? And I thought, oh my gosh, I can feel God's hand on this. but I am really scared because I am not a native Spanish speaker. I did not grow up speaking Spanish. My dad says I refused to speak it because I had a disconnection with the culture. I finally learned it when I was in Mexico living, doing my dissertation research is when I finally, was forced to learn it because I had nothing else to speak. And I never felt quite comfortable because I thought, oh my gosh, my accent's bad, or oh my gosh, I'm going to say the wrong words. Or so when I was at my institution, I had invitations to teach in Spanish, and I always said, maybe next year. And I never had that courage, but this was an opportunity. So I said, you know what? Yes. And I was also going to have a co-moderator from Chile, and he spoke multiple languages, so including English. So I said, okay, if he's in the room with me and I don't know a word, I can, text him or write in the chat and he'll help me. So I did this, and it's been this really wonderful opportunity so the books that we read are in Spanish, the conversations we have are in Spanish, and the writing assignments the students do are in Spanish. So I'm doing all this in Spanish, holding 2-hour conversations once a week. I never thought I would do that because I was never confident enough in my Spanish. And it's been a really wonderful opportunity after so many years of teaching Latin American history, and also still teaching here and there Latin American history classes alongside teaching great books to a Latin American audience, Spanish-speaking audience. Some of my students log in from Mexico. I've had students from logging in from Ecuador and Chile and Argentina and all these different places. It makes for an interesting conversation, especially when you think about things like Antigone. So when you ask questions about tyranny, right? How are we to deal with unjust laws? What's the right thing to do? When you're asking students whose families either live in a Latin American country with a dictatorship or have fled to come to the United States or to Canada, it makes for a very different kind of a conversation. So that's one thing that I really love about that. And I'm also teaching at Hildegard College, which is a great books institution that just launched last year. So this past year, I've been doing that. So teaching great books in English in person, teaching great books in Spanish online, and also teaching Latin American history, all coming together. It's become clear to me that all of this it's not as if the great conversation is something apart from my Mexican heritage. It's a part of it. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So the Franciscan friars were the first official order to come over to evangelize. Hernando Cortés had actually asked for them by name in writing. He said that they were austere, they were good, and they wouldn't ask for money. Well, I mean, they had taken a vow of poverty. So they came over in 1524, the first official contingent of 12, modeled after the 12 apostles. And they began to work with native peoples. Now, the Mexica, which most people call them Aztecs, but the appropriate name is Mexica, hence the word Mexico or Mexico. The Mexica spoke Nahuatl, and that language, because they had conquered so many people in the central Mexican region, that language became the lingua franca. So when the friars came, that was the language they encountered, even though there were other local languages. And it had been only pictographic. So the friars had a big task ahead of them, which was either to learn a pictographic language or to alphabetize it. So they chose to alphabetize it. And I gave a talk recently at Asbury University about sort of the challenges of dealing with a language that doesn't have Christian concepts and it's pictographic and not alphabetic. Okay, so the friars eventually, they started teaching children right away in the 1520s in different locations, Texcoco and Mexico City. And then in 1536, the Franciscans founded the first classical school in the Americas. And that was so the island where the Mexica lived, at the bottom of sort of the south of the island, was Mexico Tenochtitlan, and that became Mexico City. To the north of the island is a place called Tlatelolco. And so they founded the Colegio de Santiago de Tlatelolco, and that was the college, actually the College of the Holy Cross of Tlatelolco. And here they taught the sons of native nobles, and they taught them Latin. They taught them sort of basically in the great books, the humanistic tradition, which they had been trained. They brought that and trained native people, but they also had the addition of teaching them alphabetic Nahuatl. So these scholars became trilingual scholars, learning Latin, Castilian, and alphabetized Nahuatl. And they began to co-author texts with their Franciscan teachers. They wrote plays, they wrote religious texts, they wrote, literary texts. And we have these texts. And so, I'm part of this sort of body of scholars who sees the participation between the native peoples and the Christians to sort of develop this new kind of Christianity, which we now know as Mexican Catholicism. But what really got me, there's an author, a scholar called Camilla Townsend, and she's written multiple books, beautiful writer. And in one of them, she was talking about this school, and she was talking about these boys. And she said one day, the boys were kind of listening in, and they overheard the Franciscan teachers whispering about Henry VIII and his latest escapade. And they were like, what's going on? And so they overhear and they learn about Henry VIII and what's happening in Europe almost as it's happening. And when I read that, I thought, that sort of blew my mind, that Native people are globally aware. And Camilla Townsend discusses them, these students, these noble Indigenous Christian students, she calls that they consider themselves global Indigenous Christians, because they were able to not just embrace sort of the Christian part, which makes them global, but it was this knowledge, right? This humanistic training that put them into conversation. As we've been saying, all the other speakers have been talking about this conversation that we've been having for, millennia. And Native, I can't speak to all of the Americas because I don't specialize in all of it, but there are multiple intellectual traditions that pre-existed European arrival. So Native traditions had these, the intellectual, long-held intellectual traditions. So in the sort of central Mexican region, they had a very highly developed intellectual tradition that included philosophy, mostly in the form of poetry, which they called flower songs. And so most of their philosophy was rather obscure. It had a lot of imagery, and it was very, very beautiful. And so when the Native people encountered this the Christians bringing this other tradition to them, they said, we recognize that we are you and you are us. We're the same. And it's really quite beautiful to think about that moment, because, I've heard people, there was a couple of years ago, I was trying to put together a course, and an administrator at the institution was really down on the fact that we wanted to put some Plato into this course. And it was for incoming Gen 1 students, and most of them were Latino. And this administrator said, you can't have Latinos read those ancient Greeks. You need to have them see themselves. This is too distant. And I wish I had known what I know now to say, actually, the very first people in the Americas who received this, like the original Latinos, as it were, they did recognize themselves. And so these Native peoples write about themselves as ancient Romans, as ancient Greeks, as ancient Carthaginians. I mean, it is fascinating. And in some of these works that you see that are co-written, you can find some evidence of that. And I wanted to give sort of a quick example of something. So there's this text called Nahuatl Theater. It's all 20 years old now, but Volume 1, Death and Life in Colonial Nahua, Mexico. So some of you may be familiar with the medieval traditions of mystery or miracle plays, the plays that sort of come over. The religious orders, the Franciscans and Dominicans especially, decided to put on these plays outside in the vernacular, which is very important in medieval Europe because everything operated in Latin that had to do with the church. So it's in vernacular, so anybody walking by can say, oh my gosh, what's going on? Oh, and they'll learn about saints' lives or Bible stories or virtues, and things were personified, virtues and goodness and fellowship and all of that. So the friars bring this tradition over to the New World, but there's already a tradition here of recitation and performance. So it really blends together quite well. This idea of learning from stories and memorizing things and learning about your own history and beliefs. So there is one play called Final Judgment. This is translated by Louise Burkhart with assistance from Barry Sell, and they're the ones who co-authored this or edited this text. And it really struck me because the opening, you have Saint Michael. So it says, when instruments are played, heaven opens, Saint Michael descends. And then he says, O creations of God, know, and indeed you already know, for it is in the sacred commands of our Lord God that he will destroy the world that his precious and honored Father God made. He goes on and on about destruction and this and that. And towards the end, he says, so then weep, remember it, fear and be scared to death, for the day of judgment will happen to you. Now, several scholars have noted, and my students even noted, some of the ones, especially who were reading great books in the Amish College, would say, wait a minute, that sounds kind of like this idea of memory and recollection that Plato talks about. And so we see here evidence of that idea that we're not really learning anything new as we are recollecting. But there's also a connection to this Christian idea of God writing things on our hearts. So you see, okay, this is a Christianized text, but you can also see the evidence of the Platonic influence. But then there's the indigenous side and the Nawa cosmology, which does not have linear history. It's sort of cyclical. So this idea of remembering, well, you're kind of always going back and going back. So nothing is happening that's new, it's sort of repeating. So it's really fascinating. And that's just one sort of very brief example of where you can see evidence of all sorts of influence from the great tradition, this great conversation, but also that it's being indigenized, right? Or Nahuatlized, that it's making sense, and that Native peoples are entering into this conversation that has been going on. And they were having their conversations over here, and others were having them here. And finally, in the 16th century, the conversations merge. So this is really exciting to me, to think about rereading some of the texts I've been studying and teaching for years and looking for that evidence. And it really helps that I'm teaching great books at the same time, right, that I'm teaching Latin American history and reading through these things and saying, I see something that I didn't notice before. You know, you can argue that it comes from the native side in their cosmology, but it also can come from, you know, this great tradition that comes over. So I've just begun this work of sort of trying to identify indigenous voices from colonial Mexico that speak into the great conversation, that perhaps that have been speaking into the great conversation, but we haven't heard them. So there are a few scholars who are working on this. And everyone has sort of different backgrounds. Some are classicists who are looking to Latin America, whereas I'm a Latin American historian, kind of looking back to the classics, and sort of leaning on my training, which I had granted 20 or so years ago, but sort of coming back, rereading the text, reteaching those texts so that I can see the overlap. So the title of my talk, Thucydides in Tlatelolco, Herodotus in Huejotzinco, these are two Altepet or water hills, sort of city-states in Mexico. And I think I said Thucydides in Tlaxcala. So in Tlaxcala, there was and it's still there today, an outdoor theater. You can go see it behind the convento, the Franciscan friary. And this is where they would put on these plays, one of the, you know, plays like the one I was reading that would have blended those traditions together. So this is really exciting work to me. I know it's a big job, and I don't know where it's going to take me exactly, but I think it's exciting to recognize that, to sort of share what I'm learning, and to recognize that Native peoples in the Americas did recognize themselves in this tradition. They did not consider it to be a part of them. So I was wrong when I thought that the great tradition, great works was separate from my Mexican heritage. It's actually a part of it. And that's really something very joyful to me, because I had thought that I would have to separate these things out and that they wouldn't ever align. And to know that they align has been really sort of a wonderful shift, an unexpected shift in my career. So as I said, I've only just begun this work. And so using my great books training and my training as a Latin American historian, to share what I'm learning with Spanish-speaking students in the US and in Latin America, the ones that I teach online in Spanish. And I try to illustrate with them the connections between Latin America and the Great Conversation. And what we do in our online class is we always open with a poem. So rather than translating the poems in the English language program from Angelicum Academy that they've been using for 20 years, we've been finding our own poems for the Spanish program, mostly original Spanish language poetry. And I've even using some poems from the Mexica, from the Nahuas. So in Nahuatl, translated into Spanish, these laments about the fall of Tenochtitlan, for example, the day that we talked about the fall of Troy, we talk about the fall of Tenochtitlan, and we talk about this similar tradition of recitation, and poetry, and public, performance of great texts and of our histories. And it's been really wonderful to give pieces and to show my students that this is part of their tradition as well. It's not something apart from them. The program is new. And, my students, because they're in Latin America, some of them struggle to pay US prices. So I'm always looking for sponsors, and it's been difficult, but I really do appreciate this opportunity to bring my worlds together. And I like to imagine the teenage sons of Native nobles reading and discussing some of the great texts with their Franciscan teachers, at the school in Santiago de Tlatelolco and having the same sort of visceral reactions that I did when I was reading these texts, and sort of feeling like their conversations are keeping these characters alive. So when I sit and discuss great works with my students, it actually unites me with my indigenous and Franciscan historical subjects. Um, and that really is quite beautiful because we're all taking part in the same conversation. Thank you.
I love that last line when you said unites her to, and again, I hope I'm not sounding like a broken record, but again, this goes back to this, and I know we have some new people who may have jumped on this redefining of classics. You know, history tells us that we can't be unified through studying this tradition, right? I know when I first broke into studying it, I was seen as someone pulling away from my heritage. And of course, we've shown that that's not the case. Now you're telling your story, where somebody may have thought going into this Western tradition, classics or classical tradition, and they all are very distinct things. For those who are just jumping in here, I want you to understand that when we say classics, we know that they are very distinct from great books or the classical tradition. I always like to visualize it by saying classics are like kind of the seed or kind of um, the root of the tradition, I'll say. But you're saying that engaging in this work has unified you more with your heritage. And I was drawn to that statement because I felt the same way. I was shocked to
Yeah.
find that I felt the same way because I went from just loving it. I didn't know it had any connection to
Yeah.
my heritage, and there was even a shame about
Yeah.
loving this focus of study, because I felt like I was betraying my
Mhm.
community, honestly, and I finally just had to accept, well, I just love it, so you can hate me all you want, and
Yeah.
I just thought I was just gonna always be kind of in this isolated space, loving a tradition that I thought had nothing to do with my own history.
Yeah.
Seems like you were on a similar journey.
Yes. Yes. No, I did feel that I had to leave it behind if I was going to go into Latin American history. And I absolutely love what I do and this research that I do about, Native communities and how they embrace Christianity and we hear so many negative things about this period. And there certainly are. I mean, I'm not going to deny the atrocities that occurred, but when the people that I'm studying, these Franciscans working very closely together, you see that there's a collaboration there. And that collaboration resulted in what I am today, which is Mexican Catholic. So that it's very important to me to understand that history and to study that history. But again, I thought that I had to leave everything aside, everything that I had read, and I didn't have time to read it again because I had to read all these other scholarly texts. And then every year that passed, I remembered less and less. And that, as I mentioned, that made me feel sad because these characters were so alive to me and had meant so much to me, especially. I mean, I will never forget that experience of reading. My children teased me when I was telling them the other day that I felt like I fell for this literary character. And they're like, it's just a book, Mom. I said, no, you don't understand like how much I felt. I was betrayed when he kissed lies. It just was so strong to me. And that was, 30 years ago, and it still feels so strong
Mhm.
to
I felt that with Antigone. I love how you talked about Antigone in your work. She's my favorite. That's my favorite.
me. Mhm.
And when I first fell in love with her, I did. I felt like, but I could not help but see her as me.
Mm.
And it is. It's all of us. All these stories are so similar to ours. It's all of us. That story of Antigone is sacrificing everything to stand up for something that you
Mhm.
believe in.
Mhm. Mhm.
The sacrifice of losing everything.
Right.
We all can. That resonates with all of us, I think.
Mhm. Right.
Yeah. Do you find what is your biggest challenge? And please, you all, as we're talking here, I'm caught up in my own interests with her work. I'm excited to finally be able to talk with you. We've been
Sure,
talking through
yeah.
LinkedIn, but please, you all, if you have any questions you would like to ask Dr. Gutierrez, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. But do you find that when you introduce this to your community or to students from your cultural background, what is the first resistance and how long
Mm.
does that resistance last? And three, what
Mhm.
causes if the resistance goes
If there's
away, which I
resistance.
suspect that it does,
Mm.
what do you think makes it go away eventually?
Well, I think I might be So the students I'm exposed to are already enrolled in a Great Books program with me in Spanish, so there's probably not that initial resistance. But I think many of them are surprised. So I have
Mm,
students from Mexico, and so we allow adults in our programs as well. So we have teenagers, you have to be at least 14, and then any adults who's interested, you don't have to do any of the work, just show up and have the conversations in Spanish. And this is mainly because the Great Books tradition is, and Socratic discussions are it's not widely available in Latin America. So we're making this
mhm.
available to people and introducing them to this tradition in a way that, isn't really available there.
Yeah.
So I've had students from Mexico, and when I did the lament of the fall of Tenochtitlan,
Mm,
and I said that this is from a huge collection of works called the Cantares Mexicanos, which are sort of pre-contact poems, but then they were recorded later. So then, of course, you don't know about the colonial influences. But so my students from Mexico said, she said, I've never heard of this. This is an adult. She said, I, lived all my life in Mexico, and I never knew we had indigenous language poetry that we could read. And I said that, and that's a very terrible thing, because she said, what's the name of it? I'd like to get this. I'd like to read this and read it to my children. So that's been really fulfilling to be able
yeah.
to introduce. And so I guess there's not so much of a resistance, especially if I'm looking, I'm dealing with students in Latin America.
Yeah.
And if they're already coming to me to join the program, then they don't really have the resistance. They really want the knowledge, but they don't know that it has anything to do with them. And that's sort of what I'm encountering.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. And you know what? That's interesting because and I think others feel this too. As you, I discovered a written tradition in Africa through studying classics.
Hmm.
And I know some people may have a hard time when we say we're discovering ourselves through classics. Like even that alone may
Yes,
be a bit of a struggle. And I want to
sure.
make sure I acknowledge that
Yes,
struggle. And I know people who may be listening may be thinking, well, why do you have to go through the classical tradition? Why can't you just go study
sure,
it for yourself?
sure.
And it's not that I chose to go through this tradition, right? I think both of us have it was a story. You know, for me, it was my parents, we have so much in common. My parents starting a classical school
Mhm.
in a predominantly Black neighborhood, and then from
Mhm.
there, I came to connect with the classical tradition and fell in love with the literature that way. It was all by accident. It was not intentional. It
Mhm.
was not me saying, "I don't wanna learn about my heritage through
Sure.
my own people or through the voices
Mhm.
of my own people. I wanna learn it from the West." That wasn't the intention, and from all the stories we've heard so far, even if you've read Roosevelt Montas's book, he's not with us for this event. He was not able to join us, but I know his story says something similar. He stumbled upon the tradition by accident. A lot of us stumble upon it by accident. And then once you get there, though, you discover this world that's very different from the world in which we live, where our stories are intersected or somehow connected to it.
Yes.
Um, any other questions?
I see there's one question
Okay, is it
from
in the oh,
Sean.
okay, here we go.
Mhm.
Yes, is this great?
Um,
Thank go Do you want to read it? I can read it too. Is it
Sure, great present. Oh, thank you. If I'd like to direct students to the story of the fall of Tenochtitlan, where should I look? Okay, well,
mm,
I would recommend, there are several primary text readers. One is an older one called The Broken Spears by Miguel Leon Portilla, but there's an updated version of that called Victors and Vanquished, edited by Stuart Schwartz and Tatiana Mejias, I believe. Um, and it's just a collection of primary sources. And there is some commentary to introduce each text, but it's just a collection of primary sources. And it essentially tells the fall of Tenochtitlan from the indigenous perspective. And
mm.
and so that sort of the updated version kind of replaces, you can also use, I think, I don't know if everything in the new Victors and Vanquishes is in Broken Spears, but that's what I generally use. I like to have students read the actual texts the native peoples wrote. And again, much of this is written after they learn, because Nahuatl was pictographic, so they have to learn to write in alphabetic script, and they're already Christianized. So we have to recognize sort of the filters that we may see, but it's very interesting to hear their own voices about what happened. But also recognizing the bias, because like I said, Tlatelolco's in the north and Tenochtitlan is in the south. So they're different polities. So they have different associations, they have different sort of pride about their community. So they'll make fun of each other. in the text about what happened in the war. Many of us now call it the Castilian Mexica War or the Mexica Castilian War because it was 2 years. I mean, it was over 2 years long. It wasn't just like a conquest that came into place. I think that kind of is misleading. But yeah, so you have to be aware of those too. And then this text kind of tells you, it kind of leads you through that to say there's a bias here because they're going to make fun of the people of Tenochca, and then the Tenochca are going to make fun of the Tlatelolco. So you see this was not a homogeneous group of native people. They're all different communities.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like to say, based on what you just said, that it actually has driven me back to read those primary sources that are connected to my heritage. Because you're reading over, you fall in love with this tradition by accident for whatever reason, a book someone gave you, or you happen to be in a class and a teacher taught on it, and you just like, oh my gosh, this is it. But then you get into it and you find this whole other culture of people that is shared with here. Then you go find the book connected from that is a primary source from whatever heritage, and I've also liked that part about it. It has opened my eyes to things I didn't know and led me to read those primary sources. Any other questions from anyone? Well, we're gonna end here. This video from Dr. Gutierrez, I'm learning how to say everyone's names, is going to be posted in our YouTube video. If you go on YouTube and look for the channel called Redefining Classics, in about a week, these videos will be uploaded. One of the reasons why I was having technical difficulty a moment ago was I was setting up. I'm so worried that any of these amazing talks that we've had today will be lost. So I went and set up a new computer just to make sure I am making sure we don't lose any of these talks. Your talk was amazing. And so I know people will enjoy watching it and when it's posted. So give it about a week, everyone. It'll be posted. I'm going to stop the recording here.